This week, so I'll go ahead and introduce Bruce Douglas again. As Emily mentioned, he's been speaking with us about race and religion and the history of Presbyterianism. This is the second of a three-part series. This week, the focus is on segregation. And he's been speaking with us over many, many years. I think he said back 20 plus years, but Bruce, you can correct me if I'm wrong about that. Bruce is the Director Emeritus and founder of the Reformed Institute. He's also the Associate Professor Emeritus at Georgetown, and he has a Master's in Divinity from Yale and a PhD in poli-sci from Duke. He's an elder at Lewinsville Presbyterian in McLean. So thank you for joining us again, Bruce. Looking forward to your chat today. One last thing, we'll just ask that everybody hold questions until the end. And if you have a burning issue, or even if it's something you're curious about that you want to make sure we incorporate at the end of this session or perhaps in future sessions, feel free to use the chat feature. I'll monitor that and share it with Bruce at the end. So Bruce, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
You're quite welcome. I am apologetic about questions because, as you know, I usually talk to the bitter end.
Yeah.
You've noticed that, huh? But I will, I promise you, I've noted a couple of the questions that came in last week and others that hopefully will come in this week. And before I'm done next week, I will try to deal with some of those questions. Bear with me. I've got a lot to say. We're talking about the era of segregation, which is the successor to slavery. Last week, we talked about American, this is the entire focus of this is on the history in the United States. The wider history of Presbyterianism, of course, is many countries. I'm focusing simply on the United States, and I'm focusing simply on Black-white relations. Last time we talked about the era of slavery, which ends in the 1860s. The era of segregation I'm going to date as running from the 1880s through the 1950s. Let me say that again, the 1880s through the 1950s, roughly about 75 years. And this is a time in which a set of institutions and practices and beliefs were developed that comprised segregation, whose legitimacy was accepted. Let me say that again. Institutions, practices, beliefs, whose legitimacy was accepted. Indeed, not only was their legitimacy accepted, but they were codified into law and they were enforced by governmental authorities. Now, in this presentation today, I want to do four things. I want to talk first about what segregation was. My guess is that many of the people on this call have a pretty good idea of what it was. Some may have experienced it directly, but I've also observed in talking about this subject in some churches, the younger the crowd gets, the more people, this is kind of a fuzzy idea. So I want to start with some details in order to make it possible for us all to have a level playing field. And then I want to talk about the Presbyterian response to this set of institutions, practices, and beliefs. And I'm going to start with something I didn't discuss much last week, and that's the Black church. I'll start with the Black response, the Black church. Then I'll talk very briefly about the Southern white response, the Southern white Presbyterian response. And then finally, I will talk about the Northern white Presbyterian response to this set of institutions and practices. The word segregation can be interpreted in a very innocent way, as it was typically by people who defended it. In the bibliography, which I've made available to you, and that's just a small sampling of readings that are appropriate for this topic, there is reference to a lecture that was given in the Synod of Mississippi in the 1950s. The reference is to something called a Theology of Segregation. It marvelously summarizes the view of somebody who was a staunch defender of segregation. And in that lecture, Theology of Segregation, in which he affirmed that segregation was God's will and it was people's duty to uphold and maintain it, he identifies segregation almost entirely with separation. He said the idea is that God intended the races to be separate. Now, if you focus simply on the separation aspect, you can make this seem rather innocent. But I want to stress to you, if you think about the institutions and practices that I'm going to be discussing in the next minute or so, you see that it's not just separation that's involved. This is something, these institutions and practices were imposed upon the Black population for the purpose of subordinating them, for the purpose of exploiting them. Let me say that again. It was imposed upon the Black population, in many cases ruthlessly imposed upon the Black population for the purpose not just of separating, in some quotes, separating the races, but also keep the Blacks subordinate, keep the Blacks down, put them back in their place. This was a response to the brief moment of emancipation that Blacks experienced in the United States in the period that historians call Reconstruction, the 1860s and the 1870s, in which for the first time, Blacks were treated as citizens and got political rights, and then began to achieve certain kinds of social equality. And once the authority of the federal government enforcing that was withdrawn, as it was withdrawn in the 1870s, the late 1870s, then Southern whites reimposed in a new form the kind of subordination that had existed in slavery. This is a successor to slavery. In a sense, this is an attempt to maintain some of the same social inequality that existed during slavery once slavery was eliminated. I want to stress that Blacks on the whole disliked this and resisted it and very much were opposed to it. Let me say that again. Disliked it, resisted it, were opposed to it. I'll come back and talk about that. But that's a very important part of the story. They didn't particularly appreciate it at all. And again, the more benign, I'm tempted to say, spin that was put on it by white segregationists was belied by the deep dislike of it by Blacks whenever they got a chance to express themselves. It was, I want to stress, however, not just a Southern phenomenon. Let me say that again. It was not.
Sorry, a couple minutes ago. I'm perspiring because I'm doing.
It was not just a Southern phenomenon. Even though there was not formal governmental support of it outside the South, it was something that very much was practiced outside the South. And let me give you a personal experience. I think I've said to you before, I grew up in the 1950s as an adolescent in a town in southwestern Ohio. A town, by the way, where there were sort of echoes of the influence of the Ku Klux Klan. And I remember that town as a town in which, even though the schools were desegregated, Black students and white students mixing readily, especially in the public high school, in every other important respect, the Blacks were separated from the rest of us. There was a ghetto, and in the neighborhoods in which whites lived, there was not a chance in the world that Blacks were going to be living in those neighborhoods. And on the whole, Blacks did in that town menial work. It was very rare to find anybody in those communities who was a Black person who was in the professions, for example. So in the 1950s in southwestern Ohio, even though there was not legal segregation, there was very much de facto segregation. White Southerners were given a free hand to impose this set of practices starting in the 1870s, and they did rather systematically. And one of the most important things to grasp about segregation in this period is that it was accepted, authorized, and even enforced by the federal government once the Southern whites began to implement it. Let me say that again. It was accepted, it was enforced, it was authorized by the federal government, in the period we're talking about. And I want to give you two dramatic illustrations of this, which are very important in the whole history of Black-white relations in the United States. One is a famous Supreme Court decision. You may have heard about it, called Plessy versus Ferguson, which was handed down in 1896. 1896. Plessy is spelled with two S's. Plessy, Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy was a man of mixed race who lived in Louisiana, and he objected strongly to measures which were adopted by the state legislature in Louisiana, which imposed racial segregation on transportation, public transportation. And he was somebody who used trains a lot. And of course, immediately was confronted by the fact that there were white cars and black cars, and the white cars, needless to say, were rather superior in their amenities to the black cars, which he characterized as dramatically inferior. So he contested this, and it was taken all the way to the Supreme Court. And in the Supreme Court decision, the Supreme Court accepted the legitimacy of this law that was passed mandating these segregated public accommodations, accepted the legitimacy of this practice, with the famous phrase, which becomes a kind of echo down through the decades about this whole period, it was okay for this to be this policy to be enforced as long as there were separate but equal facilities, separate but equal. And that became kind of the white code in the South for segregation, separate but equal. Of course, Plessy would say there was no equality at all. Everything about the Black experience with regard to segregation was inferior. But that became a kind of dramatic manifestation of the willingness at the federal level of the federal authorities to accept these practices with the euphemism of separate but equal. That would eventually be contested powerfully by the Supreme Court in the Brown decision, which I'll get to at the very end of my remarks, in the 1950s. But through this whole era, when whites had to defend, Southern whites had to defend segregation, they would say, well, everything's equal, it's just separate, which, needless to say, was contradicted routinely by the facts. The second thing I want to point to is something which is really close to home if you're a Presbyterian, and that's the action taken by Woodrow Wilson in 1913 to segregate the civil service. Let me say that again. In 1913, Woodrow Wilson, just a few months into his presidency, segregates the civil service. Now, of course, most of you know, or I hope you have some knowledge of Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was a child of the manse. His father was a Presbyterian clergyman. His father was a very well-known Presbyterian clergyman from the South. Stanton, Virginia was the place where he pastored the leading Presbyterian church for many years. His father was a staunch defender of segregation. His father indeed was one of the proponents of the theology of segregation. And when eventually the Civil War came and the church is split, with the Southern Presbyterian Church being formed, he was somebody who was an active supporter of the split and the creation of a Southern, what was called the Presbyterian Church in the Confederate States. Indeed, he was a leading figure for a time in the the Presbyterian Church in the Confederate States. That's the background of Woodrow Wilson. Well, Woodrow Wilson imposes segregation on the civil service, and it had not previously been segregated. And of course, segregation meant for Blacks in the civil service, subordinate status, the sort of systematic imposition of a subordinate status. Now, the fascinating thing about this is the following. I find it an appalling development, but as a good Presbyterian, I find it just appalling. But the story gets even more, shall we say, dramatic as you dig into it. And that's because of the role of a man called Francis Grimke, Grimke, one of the leading figures in the history of Black Presbyterians in the United States. Francis Grimke, a freed slave who eventually studied at Princeton, became an eloquent defender of the Black community in the wider United States. At one point addressed the House of Representatives in a formal address. And he was the pastor of a famous church in Washington, D.C., 15th Street Presbyterian, which is a historic church in our denomination. Previously, it had been pastored by Henry Highland Garnett that I mentioned last time. These people, long ignored or largely neglected in the history of Presbyterianism, are really important figures. They're, in my judgment, on a par with Witherspoon and some of the leading figures that we remember as white Presbyterians. Grimke had in his congregation people who were civil servants, who were active, of course, Presbyterians, but they were also very active and ambitious figures in the employ of the federal government. Grimke was appalled by the very idea of this segregation, and he appealed to Woodrow Wilson in a letter, which is available to us through the Presbyterian Historical Society. If you're interested in a lot of these materials are available online. Grimke appealed, by the way, he had written an earlier letter in which he had complimented Wilson on his election to the presidency and said, I am so glad to see that the fate of our nation is in the hands of a good Presbyterian. And I'm so appreciating the thought of somebody with your background now serving as the chief executive of the United States. Then he writes another letter once this word about segregation of the civil services out and says, I appeal to you, please, as a fellow Presbyterian, please, Mr. President, this is wrong. This is contrary to everything which the gospel implies. Please rethink this. And I have been told, although I have not been able to pin this down, that there actually was a meeting between Grimke and some Black clergy and Woodrow Wilson in the Oval Office in which they talked about this matter in response to this letter. And the effect of the letter, basically what happened in the meeting is that Woodrow Wilson talked down to Grimke and the Blacks and told them that this was the right thing for the efficiency of the federal government, for them to be put. He didn't quite say it this bluntly, but he strongly implied it. They should be put in their place. And by the way, for anybody who has studied the history of the civil service, which is a big part of the Black experience in the United States, just think about it to this day. This is not a small matter. This is a big matter. And of course, he went through with this segregation of the civil service. The final thing I want to say about the segregation phenomenon is this. It's just a line here to be thrown in, but I could spend a whole lecture talking about it. All of the policies and practices and beliefs associated with segregation were, of course, in the South and even beyond the South. I've already referred to the area where I grew up. Even beyond the South, rigorously enforced by a kind of informal terror that was imposed by the Ku Klux Klan and other agents of white supremacy in the South. I don't need to say anything more. I think lynchings, mob violence, all that kind of thing was routinely a part of this. Well, let me just state it bluntly. This was a reign of terror. This was a reign of terror unleashed on Blacks to keep them pretty much in line. Now let me talk about the Black church and its response to this. We have been talking informally before this session started about this wonderful series that PBS has put out, and there are now books on it about the Black church. Well, the whole phenomenon of the Black church really flourishes, ironically, in the period of segregation. Let me say that again. The whole business of the Black church, the emergence of the Black church as something out in the open, which has got a life and a vitality of its own, that, ironically, is one of the benefits of the era of segregation. The Black church, I want to stress, in the sense in which it's normally discussed today, is rooted in the experience of the South. It existed in other parts of the country. I've already talked about Black Presbyterians, free Presbyterians who existed in the North before the Civil War. But the Black church really is a phenomenon of the South above all. It ripples out into other parts of the country, but it really emerges, and it emerges in the era of segregation. And by that, I mean a couple of things. I mean, first of all, the emergence of large denominations which identify themselves as Black. Protestant denominations. I mean, that's the first thing I want to stress. In this era, the 1880s on through the period of the middle of the 20th century, that's the era in which these large Black denominations, which still play a huge role in the Black community, that's when they emerge and develop. I'm talking primarily about Baptists and Methodists, the AME Church, the AME Zion, the National Baptist Church, their whole series of denominations, big denominations, bigger now than our denomination, which are Black in their leadership and Black in their fundamental identity. That's the first thing. The second thing that I'm referring to is this flourishing of the Black church in this period is a kind of massive flight of Blacks from white-dominated churches into these independent churches. Let me say that again, a massive flight. Keep in mind, during the era of slavery, the idea was that everybody would worship together. This whole idea of segregated religion comes from the era of segregation. So there was, in the period after Reconstruction, as these Black churches emerge, sort of part and parcel of that is a massive flight, exodus of Blacks from the white-dominated churches into churches of their own. Now, having said that, I need very quickly to introduce a very important caveat, and it's this. The emergence of separate Black denominations on the whole did not happen for Presbyterians. Let me say that again. The emergence of separate Black denominations. It happened for the Methodists, it happened for the Baptists, it did not happen for the Presbyterians or the Anglicans or the Congregationalists. Let me say that again. In those three, the Congregationalists, Presbyterians, Anglicans, what instead emerged were separate Black congregations, but not denominations, if you follow what I'm saying. Separate Black congregations, but not denominations. And then those separate Black congregations become a kind of denomination within a denomination. Let me say that again. These separate Black congregations, like 15th Street down in the center of Washington, become a kind of denomination within a denomination for the following reason. Even though we did not have an entire full-blown Presbyterian denomination that was Black emerging, what did emerge was this. The emergence of separate, not only congregations that were Black, but also presbyteries and synods. Let me say that again. The emergence of separate Black presbyteries and synods, which ultimately were under the leadership, under the aegis of
Good luck.
Of a General Assembly. So we have, and it's a very interesting and curious thing, for the longest time among Presbyterians, you have the Blacks are still within the major denomination, the white denomination, but they are a kind of church unto themselves with their own leadership and so forth. The only caveat to that, and it's a very important caveat, is this. On the whole, the Blacks who pastored Presbyterian churches were highly educated people. Where were they educated? They were educated primarily on predominantly white seminaries. Let me say that again. They were educated at predominantly white seminaries, which tells you that there was some room for, if you will, non-segregated Black experience in the Presbyterian church. And the same thing was true of Congregationalist and Anglican. Now, the reason why this flourishing of Black churches in this period is there are just so many reasons why it's interesting and important and really a kind of fascinating subject is the following. As has been illustrated by the PBS series and other writings on this topic, is the following. During this period, the Black church becomes the center of Black culture. Let me say that again. The Black church becomes the center of Black culture. So much of the wider world for the Black, especially in the South, is dominated by whites, is controlled by whites, is manipulated by whites. And here's this kind of enclave of a relative autonomy, which is the church. And so the church becomes a kind of center of culture for the Black community. And so that even people who are somewhat skeptical about the church, Du Bois, for example, sort of critical of the church, admit that the Black church played an enormously important role in enabling Blacks to come together, develop their identity, and ultimately assert their interests. A very important part of this is the emergence of through the Black church of opportunities for Blacks to begin to acquire leadership skills and sometimes the education that would enable them to become leaders in their communities. I'll get to the education part in a moment. It's no accident that to this day in the Black community, oftentimes one of the most important figures is the clergy person. The clergy person becomes a hugely important figure because of the centrality of the Black church in this phase of the development of Black history. One other thing to note about this is that in these churches, we can now say more than I think people could have said before because of the study of this, the study of this whole phenomenon of Black Protestant, and it's mainly Protestant, by the way. There are very few Roman Catholics. This is overwhelmingly a Protestant phenomenon. The emergence of these Protestant Black churches creates an environment for the development of Black theology. Let me stress that, the development of Black theology. And it takes two different forms. Sometimes it's a highly populist form, which is almost anti-intellectual. And that's very much the tradition of the Black Baptists for the longest time, kind of skeptical about learning, skeptical about people being highly trained in order to perform ministerial functions. But among, predictably, the ones I mentioned as having a sort of different history, the Presbyterians, the Congregationalists, and the Anglicans, there was a stress on clergy being educated, clergy being trained in order to perform ministerial functions. And in those churches, what emerges is a kind of, I would say, a much more sophisticated version of what I'm going to be characterizing in all these talks as Black theology, a distinctive Black theology. And I've already hinted at what its main themes are. Let me just hint again, and then I'll talk much more about it in the next presentation. One is a very strong emphasis on the Bible as a story of liberation. The Bible as a story of liberation. One of the most fascinating things about this whole study of the Black church is you begin to see reading the Bible Black is a little different thing than reading the Bible white. And in the preaching in particular of the clergy in this period, there's a very strong emphasis on the book of Exodus, as though the book of Exodus is almost the fulcrum point around which the whole biblical narrative turns. The story of the Bible is liberation to the captives. And then, of course, the other theme is, closely related theme is, and I've already mentioned this, is the idea of social justice. Why? Because all the way along, through slavery and even more after slavery, there's an insistence upon the Black community, we have been wronged. We have been wronged, and in order for justice to be done, there must be some kind of reckoning with the wrong that has been done to us. Now, I could go on talking about the Black church, but I really do need to move on to the other parts of this story. In the period of, just a summary comment, in the period of segregation, the Black church develops expansively, develops a kind of culture for the Black community, which is the source, the seedbed out of which emerge many of the things that we're familiar with in the period of desegregation. Martin Luther King does not just happen. Martin Luther King is an extension, you'll see it when I get to talking about King, is an extension of many of the things that were developing for decades. Keep in mind that his father was a prominent Baptist clergyman, pastoring for decades before he comes on the scene in the 1950s. So a lot of the background to the civil rights movement lies in the development of the Black church, especially in the South, in the early decades of the 20th century. What about Southern white Presbyterians? Now, let me remind you of something which probably many of you know, but let me just remind you of this. The Southern states, the Presbyterian Church in the states of the Confederacy broke off from the PCUSA in 1861, forming the Presbyterian Church in the Confederate States, forming a separate denomination. At the very end of my last presentation, I talked about Presbyterians trying to hold things together in the midst of this great debate over slavery that took place before the Civil War. And I said, ultimately, that was a failure because There was schism after schism leading up to the Great Schism in 1861. When a whole section of the country among Presbyterians moved away from the national denomination. Now, the important thing to note is that separation endured all the way up to the 1980s. Let me say that again. That separation endured all the way up to the 1980s. And part of the reason for it was that in this period, the era of segregation, there developed a different ethos among Southern Presbyterians from the wider, the rest of the nation. And for the longest time, there was a strong attachment to that separate Southern way among Southern Presbyterians. I'll talk next time about how eventually the schism is overcome, but just think about that. For much of Presbyterian history in this country, a long, long time, better than a century, there is this division, which if you sort of peel away the sources of it, it has to do ultimately with the issue of race. It has to do with a lot of other things, but I would argue ultimately it has to do with race. Now, what about, therefore, I can talk in this period about the Southern Presbyterians. Southern Presbyterians. The PCUS, the Presbyterian Church in the Confederate States, eventually becomes the Presbyterian Church in the United States. The PCUS is just an extension, a rebranding, if you will, of the Presbyterian Church in the Confederacy. On the whole, whites in that period, from the 1880s through the 1950s, were, on the whole, staunch defenders of segregation. On the whole, they were staunch defenders and practitioners of segregation, including in church life. Believe it or not, especially in the Deep South, it was standard policy for Presbyterians, when pressed at all about this, to say it is best for us to worship separately. And when there were challenges to that began to develop in the 1950s and 60s in something called kneel-ins, which is related, of course, to sit-ins, they called the cops. They called the cops in order to enforce their policy that no blacks should be worshiping with whites. They worship over there, we worship here. So there was a, shall we say, an affirmation, a vigorous affirmation of segregation as something that was desirable. And I've referred you already to that Theology of Segregation. It's not a long read. I commend that to you. It's a good sort of sample for what somebody who's white, who's a segregationist, thinks. And the other thing to note about white Presbyterians in this period, very interesting thing to note, they had very little outreach to blacks. They just washed their hands of blacks for the longest time. Blacks went their way, whites went their way, and there was very little sort of rapport interaction with them. Now, having said that, I want to acknowledge, and I'm just going to briefly mention it because I don't think it deserves any more than a brief mention. There were all along in the South white Presbyterians who did not like segregation, who opposed segregation publicly, but they were a small minority, and on the whole, they had very little influence until the period I'll be talking about next time. This was a period in which the Southern Presbyterian Church was dominated by segregationists and proponents of the segregationist idea. Now, what about the response to the phenomenon of segregation of Northern white Presbyterians? And by Northern, keep in mind, it's in quotation marks, it's everybody outside the South. California includes the North here. It's the non-Southern Presbyterians. That's where the PCUSA existed throughout this period. I'm going to make three broad generalizations about the Northern white response to segregation. The first of those is the following. On the whole, in this period, about 75 years, there was tacit acceptance of the legitimacy of segregation. Let me say that again. Tacit acceptance of the legitimacy of segregation. There was no strong defense of it, unlike in the South. But, and this is a very striking thing when you see it in historical perspective, there was nothing in this period comparable to the fierce debates that took place in the period about slavery, or the period of slavery. Let me say that again. Last time I emphasized to you, in the period of slavery, Presbyterians, white Presbyterians, were almost at each other's throats over the issue of slavery. They debated it. They thought about it. They passed motion after motion. And many of them were organized associations in the wider society that were in effect abolitionist societies. And then of course the defenders of slavery were on the other side. And sometimes they would meet in the same church. I've already told you that in the church where I now worship and where I'm an elder, the Lewinsville Presbyterian Church in McLean, Virginia, the church goes back to the 1840s, and it's pretty clear that in the debates that took place in the 1840s and 50s, the church was deeply divided. It never split, but it was deeply divided over this issue. So much so that one minister had to leave because of the support that he gave to the institution of slavery and the opposition that aroused in the congregation. So in that period of slavery, you might say you had sort of constant attention to this matter. The fascinating thing about the period of segregation is no such thing existed. Let me say that again. No such debates, no such intense engagement with the question of the morality of segregation. So that's the first thing. And boy, that's important, I think. There was a kind of, I'm tempted to say, almost silence that came over the Northern Church with respect to the morality of their treatment, the white treatment of Blacks. And of course, the obvious question that occurs to you, well, why would there be that silence? And if this were a class and we had 17 weeks, we'd talk about that, but we haven't got 17 weeks, so I'm just going to let it dangle in the air. But sometimes people are so afraid of engaging something, or alternatively are so indifferent to, that they just refuse to talk about, you might say, the elephant in the room. So that's the first thing. And I want to stress, it's the most important thing to mention in this context. You don't get anything like the Presbytery debates and the Synod debates and the General Assembly debates about the morality of segregation that occurred in the era of slavery. But secondly, very interesting parallel development of a quite different sort. Once the slaves were emancipated, an issue arose which had long been sort of right beneath the surface, came right up to the surface, and it's this. How are we going to accommodate this population of people who, on the whole, are completely unlettered, are completely without cultural formation? How are we going to deal with a population of free Blacks who, on the whole, are illiterate and, of course, lack economic resources? That was the great worry of people. You might say the most humane and most thoughtful whites who were involved in discussions of slavery worried about, well, what is going to come after liberation? And one of the great themes of the mainline churches in this period is the following. Well, something has got to be done about that immediately. They pressed for public action. They pressed for a lot of action in the South to create opportunities for literacy and generally education among the Black population as soon as possible. And at the very beginning of that period of Reconstruction, there was a lot of action on that front. And many people began to be hopeful because the interesting thing was the Blacks who were not literate gravitated to these opportunities to learn. There was a kind of hunger for literacy that quickly manifested itself. But then when the federal government withdrew from any kind of, shall we say, aggressive action in the South, then the interesting thing is the mainline Protestant churches stepped right into that breach and said, we've got to do what we've been asking the government to do, and the government's not going to do it. So we're going to step into that, and we are going to become the missionaries for education in the South. And so an organization was formed called the American Missionary Society, which was made up of Anglicans, Presbyterians, Congregationalists, and a couple of others, but mainly those three. It was formed to what? Mobilize people in the North to go south to function as teachers, above all as teachers, evangelists as well, to be sure, but mainly teachers to try to correct this problem of massive illiteracy on the part of the Black population. Presbyterians, it won't surprise you, Presbyterians were among the leaders of that. And they sent scores, hundreds, in fact, of people to the South, and many of whom spent most of their adult careers in teaching Blacks in the South, especially in the northern part of the South, let me stress. Places like North Carolina, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, that area, that was the area where they were most concentrated, and Tennessee was another place, and most effective. The result was the creation of a whole set of schools that eventually, some of which morphed into the private part of the HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, HBCUs. If you look carefully at the history of the HBCs, and eventually the U comes later, the historically Black colleges, the private ones in the South, there were scores of them, and most all of them were created by money and personnel coming from these northern churches. The big Presbyterian institution was something called Johnson C. Smith in North Carolina. It morphed into becoming Johnson C. Smith University. It had a name of a philanthropist from Pittsburgh named Biddle before. Fisk was one of these institutions. Howard was one of these institutions. Morehouse was one of these institutions. I could go on, a whole series of these, by the way, which exist to this day, of course. Now, this is kind of the sequel to what I was saying earlier about the historically Black church being a kind of seedbed for the development of Black culture. Now you've got complementing the historically Black church, these historically Black institutions, which invited the Black community to aspire to what? The standing in society, the role in society of professional people. And so out of that begins to emerge what eventually was characterized by Du Bois and others as the talented 10th. The talented 10th of the Black community, very interesting phrase. The talented 10th were what? People who acquired enough learning to be able, and enough degrees to be able to become physicians and lawyers and educators and clergy, of course. In short, a very important resource in the development of what sort of the broad outcome is the Black middle class. So we can say that even though there was this odd, and I would say disturbing silence on the issue of the morality of segregation, de facto, these people were, through their, in most cases, religious conviction, addressing the problem in a practical way through their very strong emphasis on segregation, on education, excuse me. Now, let me say one final thing about that before going on to the remaining theme in my presentation. Another aspect of this, which has been unearthed and discussed in very fruitful ways by scholars, is this. A lot of the people who migrated from the North to teach in these oftentimes academies that eventually became colleges were women. And there was great debate in the North about the propriety of sending women, and especially single women, to teach in this very hostile environment, as they understood it. And oftentimes it was a hostile environment. But after a lot of hand-wringing and a lot of sort of uncertainty about this, on the whole, they did in fact do what the women who were anxious to do this wanted to see happen. That is, they authorized them to go, they supported them financially, and as a result, this became a real vocational opportunity for many women who otherwise might have lacked the kind of educational opportunity that it provided. The final thing I want to talk about in the 3 points I want to make about the Northern white Presbyterian response to segregation is the following. Beginning in the early part of the 20th century, the early 1900s, you begin to see signs of some opposition to segregation. I'm stating it cautiously, signs of some opposition, nothing wholesale, nothing as as wide-ranging as what happened in the slavery era, but still some opposition. People begin writing about segregation as a problem. People begin speaking about racial segregation as a problem. And this happens primarily in two locations initially. One is theological seminaries. Theological seminaries. Especially theological seminaries who were identified as more liberal. Colgate Rochester, Yale, Harvard, some others I might mention. Now, in those seminaries, there was a body of thought developing that is an important chapter in the history of Protestant theology in America called the social gospel. Social gospel was beginning to develop and by the early 20th century flourishing in the theological seminaries. And the social gospel, you might say, boiled down to its core idea is this, that the gospel has direct implications for the structuring of social institutions and for social policy. That's the key idea. The Christian gospel has direct implications for the structuring of social institutions and for the design of public policy. Very controversial idea at the time, but it was a very important theme in theological education in those years. And once you start thinking in those terms, and by the way, Martin Luther King was sort of cut his teeth on this kind of stuff eventually. Once you start thinking in those terms, you can see how very quickly you might be moving in the direction of thinking of segregation as a problem. The other theological influence which eventually feeds into this is the kind of the successor to the social gospel that you've heard, those of you who've been in classes that I've taught at Potomac before have heard me discuss a lot, something called neo-orthodoxy, and especially two figures, Reinhold Niebuhr and Richard Niebuhr, the Niebuhr brothers. I commend to you, if you're interested in this topic, a book written in the 1930s by Richard Niebuhr, 1930s, and it's called The Social Sources of Denominationalism. It's one of the most important books in my formation that I ever read. Social Sources of Denominationalism, because it talks about the way in which categories like social class and race have deeply affected our ability to be the church in the United States. Not affected is a weak word, have compromised our ability to be the church in the United States. Now, I commend that to you for the following reason. In that book, written in the 1930s, is a book about the segregated church as a betrayal of the gospel, the segregated church as a betrayal of the gospel. It's an angry chapter. It sort of blasts the whole idea of the segregated church. Now, that tells you that somebody at that time sort of beginning to achieve some stature in the world of theological education is thinking in very critical terms about segregation. So one source of you might say dissenting ideas about segregation is the theological seminaries. And by the way, let me just say parenthetically, as an academic, I think one of the main institutions of academic, one of the main purposes, that's the wrong word, one of the main services that academic institutions can perform when they're doing their job well is to serve as incubators of ideas that need to be developed that the wider society is uncomfortable with. You have long history of that, of academic institutions playing that role. And in the case of the church, more often than not, it's theological seminaries which do that. But the other thing I want to stress as a source of critical thinking, questioning about the legitimacy of segregation is the ecumenical movement. The ecumenical movement all the way from the very local level where you have ministerial associations. Oftentimes that's the most common manifestation of it in the local church. It's the fact that your pastor is part of a group of pastors that meet on a regular basis to share ideas and just have fellowship with one another. Reinhold Niebuhr was a pastor in Detroit before he became a famous theologian. He was a pastor in Detroit at a time when Detroit, by the way, was kind of a seething cauldron of social conflict over industrial relations, but also race relations. And he describes his awakening to the importance of the race problem, as he calls it, being these ministerial association meetings, where he suddenly confronts Black clergy, you might say, on equal terms. He wasn't used to having that experience. But he confronts Black clergy who say, well, there's also this race problem, Reinhold. We've got to think about that. And because of that, he eventually became the chairman of the Mayor's Council on Race Relations. Now, that's a sort of microcosm. What typically happened at the, you might say, the higher levels of the ecumenical movement was the following. There was something called the Federal Council of Churches that was created in 1908, eventually morphed into the National Council of Churches. And that was part of a global movement, which eventually led to the World Council of Churches. But starting with the Federal Council of Churches, you have a kind of, Niebuhr again talks about this in a very interesting way, Reinhold. You have an interesting phenomenon, and that is when the Federal Council of Churches was formed in 1908, they invited representatives of the Black churches to be part of the council. Well, what's the significance of that? Well, for the first time, you have Black clergy sitting at the same table with white clergy and in a very real way being treated as equals. And you begin to get this Black voice saying, segregation is a problem. I'm tempted to say, please, segregation is a problem. Take a look. I'm sure that was just about the tone. Like, I know you've got other concerns, but this is a problem. And gradually that consciousness begins to seep into their minds. And then, of course, the larger ecumenical movement has the following quality. Not early in the days, but as time goes by over the course of the 20th century, as they go to these global meetings, they start rubbing shoulders with representatives from other countries who have Black and brown skin. And those people from other countries start saying, what's going on with these separate, even water fountains? What's going on here? What's the justification for that? And the white representatives, largely white representatives of the American churches, are asked to defend segregation in that global context with a multiracial character. As a result of that, the Federal Council of Churches became a rather leading advocate of the white churches having at least some concern with the race problem, as it was called. But they didn't know quite what to do about it. There was a kind of awkwardness. They had a committee that met with it, committee met and met and met. Eventually they came up with this idea. In the early 1920s, the Federal Council of Churches asked the churches, the member churches, to have something called Race Relations Sunday. And a number of the churches, including the PCUSA, did that. They had Race Relations Sunday. Keep in mind, Race Relations Sunday at a time when segregation is in effect, the law of the land. And they kept doing that over and over and over again. And there is some evidence that that began to create a kind of, I'm going to use the word unease among white Protestants in the mainline churches in the North about this whole phenomenon, but nothing more than unease. But that unease developed at least to the point where in the late 1940s, again with the urging of the Federal Council of Churches, soon to become the National Council of Churches, the PCUSA General Assembly adopted the following proposition. Our goal is an unsegregated church in an unsegregated society. That became the mantra of the at least the ecumenically minded denominations in the late 1940s. But that's frankly pretty weak tea.
Oh.
That's a nice pronouncement, but what are you going to do about it? There's still the overwhelming segregation, and segregation in some cases still ruthlessly enforced. Now, having said all that, let me stress, things begin to change slowly but dramatically in the aftermath of the Second World War. It's the aftermath of the Second World War when you might say, the beginning of the sort of challenge, the serious challenge to segregation unfolds in this country. And I want to stress, it unfolds without very much help from the churches. Let me say that again. You can't say that the churches set this process in motion. There was some unease in the churches, but nothing more than that. On the whole, the churches sort of, insofar as they did anything, they passed a resolution, but certainly nothing more vigorous than that. So where did action come from? Why did things begin to change? Well, that's another complicated question. If we had 17 weeks or 14 weeks, we would talk about that in more detail. All I want to stress to you is the following. There was a significant change that began to unfold in American society, and I want to stress it came about mainly because of the action of the federal government. I know there are people who think, well, if the federal government had only kept its hands off, things would have worked out fine. To which I say, that I've got a bridge to sell you somewhere. That's pretty implausible, given the relevant facts. The country was not moving strongly in that direction at all. But two things happened, which are of great importance, which are both federal actions that began to break the logjam, so to speak. One was the action, kind of a parallel, a bookend to Woodrow Wilson. Harry Truman, by executive action, desegregated the military in 1948. Bam, by executive action. Now keep in mind, he had wanted very much in the aftermath of the Second World War to get the Congress to take action on this, and it will not surprise you at all to learn that there was a block of senators, mainly from the South, who resisted that stoutly. And so nothing happened with regard to the, and keep in mind, Black soldiers had fought in the Second World War, had fought in the First World War. Harry Truman's view was, it's time to desegregate. And so he just took action. And I've talked to a number of people with military careers who said this was a terribly important development in the history of the American military, not to speak of the importance in the wider society. But you can imagine the ripple effect out into the wider society as gradually this is implemented. And by the way, as it began to be implemented, there was stout resistance in the Congress. Stennis, for example, from Mississippi, characterized it as unconstitutional, can't do it, wrong. There were lawsuits. It happened anyway. Began to change the color of American society. But then the other thing that happened was this. In 1954, the Warren Court, of course, through the Brown decision, the famous Brown decision, one of the most important decisions in the history of constitutional law in our country, decrees that segregated education is a denial of equal opportunity, is a denial of equal protection. In fact, it reversed the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. It said, and by the way, it dropped like a bombshell into American society because everywhere you had these segregated schools in varying degrees, and set in motion, of course, an elaborate process of struggling with the issue of segregated schools in American society, which frankly is still going on. Mm. But the most important thing to say about it initially is the following. These two things delegitimize segregation as a principle. Let me say that again. Even though they had enormous trouble in working them out, they delegitimized segregation as a principle. They got the country thinking about the legitimacy of segregation. However, I'm about done, bear with me. However, there was such stout resistance to the idea of segregating the schools, such massive resistance, to use the phrase that was employed here in Virginia, under Harry Byrd's leadership, here in Virginia, I'm speaking from Virginia, they probably, if there had not been one other development, that whole set of things I've just been talking about, especially the demand that schools be desegregated, probably would have just fizzled. I think it could have easily have fizzled had it not been for the following. In the middle decades, in the middle years of the 1950s, there arose in the South a movement of opposition to segregated public facilities. The thing I was talking about earlier back with Plessy versus Ferguson. And it was an attack, of course, upon segregated buses and segregated lunch counters And it involved kind of a surprising actor, given the fact that the Black church had not had much long history of active challenging segregation directly. It was surprising to see that much of the leadership came from Black clergy in places like Montgomery, Alabama. I'm referring in particular, of course, to the famous Montgomery bus boycott of 1955. And Rosa Parks, you might say Rosa Parks starts the whole thing, refuses to go to the back of the bus. There's a famous song from that period, not going to go to the back of the bus. The demand that she go to the back of the bus was, of course, a sort of symbolic representation of segregation. She, urged on by the NAACP, indeed plotted by the NAACP, refused to go to the back of the bus, and that leads to a bus boycott and then a whole series of direct challenges coming from largely poor Blacks to these institutions, leads to the spread of nonviolent, aggressive but nonviolent challenges to segregation in public policy. Now, in the middle of all that, something happens, and here I'm done. In the middle of all that, something happens, which is the following. King, thinking strategically, says the only way we can win this battle, and by the way, King is a young man, 26 years old at the time it starts, just fresh out of graduate school, newly minted pastor in Montgomery, Alabama. He says, the only way we can really win this thing is if we appeal to the conscience of the nation. And the only way we can appeal directly to the conscience of the nation effectively is to appeal to the white churches. And they do. They appeal to the white churches, mainly those churches in the federal, then what became the National Council of Churches. They appealed to them for active support of their campaign of resistance to segregation. And I have to say, lo and behold, the white churches responded with strong support. Now, I put it that way because the white churches had not exactly had a long history of strong support for anything like resistance to segregation. But in that period, in that moment, and I'll talk about this next week, they did respond. Indeed, they became one of the most important factors in what becomes the denouement of all that, which is the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, which officially, you might say, delegitimizes segregation. My last word on that is the following. When that legislation was passed, Hubert Humphrey, who was the floor manager for the legislation, was quoted as saying, this thing would never have happened had it not been for the churches. And of course, what he meant was the white churches in the wider nation. Now, how that happened, that's for next week.
Wonderful. It's a great place to stop. Thanks so much, Bruce.
All right, I see some questions here, and I'm just gonna duck them until next week. There are. Well, let me just answer. Can I take 2 minutes, or not?
Sure.
No, one.
I'll take one because I can answer Dave Strump's question real quickly. Yes. Why was it primarily a Protestant movement? Why not Catholic? And by the way, the Quakers did. How about among Quakers who were more staunch abolitionists? All of that is. It was primarily a Protestant movement, I think, because of the setting of the South, in which that was the kind of Christianity to which most of the Blacks had been exposed. They hadn't been exposed to much Catholic Christianity. And also the Catholics were very tepid and very cautious in their resistance to segregation until well into the 20th century, for reasons that I think I've already indicated. How about among Quakers who were more staunch abolitionists? My guess is, I don't have a good answer to that, but my guess is it's because the Quakers all along were a small body compared to this much larger army of mainline Protestants who were active in this matter. I'll get to the others, at least some of them, next week.